Well, Lucky, I'll thank you again for taking a few minutes to talk with us. It is a rare honor and a privilege to get to talk to veterans from the 100th Bomb Group. And I know you have a lot of unique experiences to share, having been there during some of the early days of the group. But I'll start back kind of at the beginning where it started for you, in that you joined the U.S. Army Air Forces shortly after Pearl Harbor, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what it was like to train as an aviation cadet.
Sure. Well, by joining up almost immediately following Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps, of course, had a tremendous influx of personnel. And as a result, when I joined the aviation cadets, they accepted me, but put me on leave and said, well, we'll call you when we can fit you into the pipeline. So they did. I actually joined up. I think my date of enlistment is sometime in January of '42. And in March, they notified me that I would be sent to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama, for my pre-flight. And I reported there on the 1st of May. One of the first things they did was there were 4,000 cadets there. And they marched us out to a parade ground and selected a few of us to, I guess, try out to be appointed as the wing adjutant. And the tryout was to stand in the middle of the field and scream as loud as you could, "Pass and review." I won. So I guess maybe my hog calling days back in Tennessee came into play there. I don't know, but I was fortunate enough to have been selected as the wing adjutant, who was actually the second in command of the cadet corps of that class. And this was to prove later on to be a distinct advantage to me. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. But the commander of the regiment, the cadet who was selected, was a young man by the name of Bert Shaber, S-H-A-B-E-R. And he was not very tall, not very impressive at all, rather quiet guy. But he was selected as the cadet commander of the entire 4,000 cadet corps, all the way through flying training. And I didn't see him because once we finished our pre-flight training, which was 9 weeks, we were divided up into groups of about 100 and sent out to various air bases for our primary training. And I was sent to Avon Park, Florida, learned to fly the PT-17, the Stearman cadet, and was, I guess, sort of automatically, because I'd been a cadet officer in pre-flight, was designated as the cadet captain of my class. Graduating from primary, I was sent to Shaw Field in Sumter, South Carolina for my basic training. And that was a big step up, because from a biplane of 225 horsepower, we were thrown into a Vultee vibrator, a BT-13, which was 450 horsepower and quite a bit larger, low wing airplane with retractable gear and flaps and a lot of other things that we had to learn how to operate. You were allowed 12 hours of dual training. And if you were unable to solo at the end of that 12 hours, you were washed out. Well, I was having difficulty really mastering that big leap up from the primary trainer to the basic trainer. I was a cadet captain of my class there as well, and had an officer, a lieutenant, second lieutenant, West Pointer, who was my instructor, and he was not able to really instruct me. He couldn't fly the airplane himself, but he certainly wasn't imparting any instruction to me as to how to handle the aircraft. And I was on the verge or the brink of actually being washed out. And I think the fact that I was the cadet captain of the class gave them some second thoughts, because I learned later that a civilian instructor had heard about the fact that I was about to be washed out, and he said, well, it's going to be a bad morale factor if the captain of the class can't gets washed out. So let me take him for 30 minutes. And if I can't solo him, then you can wash him out. So he approached me and told me to go out and get in an airplane. And he got in the back seat, and we flew out to an auxiliary field, landed, and he got out on the wing and he said, now, well, he had taken me up. I'm getting ahead of myself. He had taken me up and really wrung the airplane out. He showed me how to stall, how to recover from stalls, and how to loop it. And he had over 6,000 hours in the airplane, so he was really able to make it do anything he wanted to, and he could fly the airplane. And he taught me more in that 30 minutes than I'd learned in 10 hours of instruction from this lieutenant. So he climbed out on the wing of the plane, and he said, now, Luckadoo, if you take this airplane off and fly it around the pattern and land it 3 times, while I go over and sit under that tree and smoke a cigarette, you pass. So he gets out and goes over and sits under the tree, and I very gingerly take the thing off and fly it around the pattern and make 3 landings. I don't recall how good they were or bad, but at any rate, he comes back and gets in the airplane. He says, let's go back to the base. So we fly back to the base, and he gets out and starts walking into the ready room and turns around and just gives me a thumbs up. So that's how I kept from being washed out in the middle of my training. And I was very grateful to him, because he really saved my neck. I went ahead and completed basic, and then was sent down to Valdosta, Georgia for advanced training on twin engines. And when I got to Valdosta, here came this, they also had a contingent of single engine pilots who were going to be fighter pilots on the same base going through at the same time. And Bert Shaber was the captain of the single engine class, and I was the captain of the twin engine class. Well, at graduation in February of '43, he was not in evidence, and I could never, that puzzled me greatly, but I was so glad to have gotten my wings and my commission that I didn't think a whole lot about it. Only to find out some months later that they had discovered while he was going through training that he was a German plant. And they allowed him to get all the way through to graduation before they lowered the boom on him. But he had immigrated with his family at 15 from Germany. Shaber was a German name, of course, and that should have, I guess, caused some suspicions to start with. But at any rate, it was quite a shock and a surprise to learn that that he was a mole, and so he didn't graduate with us. But as you know, uh, upon graduation, 40 of my classmates from twin engine uh, flight school and I were sent to Kearney, Nebraska to join the 100th Bomb Group immediately out of flying school. And we were, of course, assigned as co-pilots to replace all of the co-pilots in the group. Now, that was one of the most mysterious things to happen, I think, during World War II, as to why in the world, just before the group was about to be sent overseas, would they suddenly remove all of the co-pilots and replace them with us newly minted pilots who'd never been in a B-17. Heck, we'd never seen anything as large as a 4-engine airplane in our lives. And here we were stuck in the right-hand seat, second in command of a 10-man crew, to learn how to fly B-17s, not with any combat instruction, but only from the pilot we were assigned to. And that was an extremely hazardous and unfortunate thing to have had occur. And so far as we've been able to determine, it didn't happen in any other group. And why it happened to the 100th group is still, to this day, unknown.
That's definitely an interesting way of, coming into the 100th. And one thing I find so fascinating, we watch movies these days and the people portraying World War II veterans are probably in their 30s in real life. But you guys were young, you were in your early 20s. And I know in your case, if my math is right, you were 21 as a second lieutenant when you started flying combat missions in 1943. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the weight on your shoulders as a pilot, but also a leader within the crew.
Well, I will mention, of course, that as replacement co-pilots, we were not always welcomed by the crews that we were assigned to. It so happened that the crew that I was assigned to, the navigator and the bombardier, were very fond of their co-pilot. They buddied with him and hung out with him, and they were crestfallen when he was removed, and they proceeded to make my life hell because they resented the fact that I didn't know anything about the B-17, and I was thrust into their crew, forced down their throats, and so they didn't really. They were pretty resentful and hurt by this move, and it was sort of juvenile on their part to make my life miserable because after all, I was second in command of the crew, and if anything incapacitated the pilot, I was to take over. And sure enough, that happened when we hit Newfoundland en route to our overseas base. I don't know whether you're aware or not, but when we got to Newfoundland, we had to await a tailwind, or else we couldn't make it all the way to Scotland, even with our additional fuel tanks and carrying extra fuel in the bomb bays. While we were waiting, the pilot I was assigned to misbehaved and went across the base one night while we were cooling our heels, waiting on the winds to be favorable, and managed to get himself involved with a British WAF that infected him, and he got thrown in the hospital with a raging case of VD. And the whole group proceeded to combat while we sat there for 2 additional weeks waiting for him to recover. And then it became pretty obvious to this navigator and bombardier that had been so hostile to me and hadn't really welcomed me into the fraternity of the crew, that I was going to have to fly the airplane, because when he was finally released, after having been treated with sulfa, which was the only thing that they had in those days, he was so weak he couldn't stand up. And they actually had to load him into the airplane. And he said, well, Lucky, you're going to have to fly, because I'll monitor the instrument, the engines and the instruments, and help you as much as I can. But he was so weak he could hardly talk, much less walk or function. And we took off. Before we did, I called the navigator and the bombardier in, and I said, you guys have made my life miserable, but you've now got to depend on me to get us to combat. And I pointed to the navigator and I said, now you little so-and-so, if you don't hit landfall on the nose, I'm personally going to throw your butt out of the airplane without a parachute. So that sort of leveled the playing field, as it were. And from then on, things were a little bit more comfortable among us. But sure enough, he was a good navigator, and he did hit the landfall on the nose. And so we got to combat, but as you probably are aware, when the group arrived in England, our base at Thorpe Abbotts was not completed. And they were sent, instead of to Thorpe Abbotts, to Poddington, where they stayed for several days. And then by the time we arrived, 2 weeks later, they had moved into Thorpe Abbotts, and we flew directly from Prestwick to Thorpe Abbotts and joined the group. But they had already been on some practice missions, hadn't flown combat as yet, because we flew the first combat missions that the 100 flew. And because of the embarrassment of his escapade at Newfoundland, I think my pilot was determined that he was going to redeem himself by completing a tour as rapidly as possible and getting back home to his family, which he did. I ended up, as you probably are aware, as the first pilot in the 100th bomb group to complete a 25 mission tour.
It's definitely an interesting turn of events that got you guys there and put you in the captain's chair early. That's interesting. I know one thing we had talked about before. I had mentioned to you my interest in the topic of leadership, and you mentioned that you had a lot of admiration and respect for Jack Kidd as a leader, and I know he often faced a lot of tough times in that leadership position in the 100th. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what it was you respected about Jack Kidd as a leader.
Sure. We met a lot of people, different people of different characteristics and different abilities in the service. And some you learned to have some respect for, and others you didn't. When the group went to England, originally Jack Kidd was the commander of the 351st Squadron. And en route, he was relieved and designated as the group operations officer. And Ollie Turner succeeded him as the squadron commander of the 351st, which we were assigned to. It was not long afterwards that I became aware of Major Kidd's tremendous talent, because he functioned as the group operations officer in an exemplary fashion by not only handling the personnel matters of the various crews and squadron commanders. He was responsible for appointing those as well, but also as an air leader, because he took on the worst missions that we flew. He flew to Regensburg, he flew to Bremen, he flew to um, uh, on all of the worst missions, and of course the one to Bremen, which turned out to be my worst mission, and his as well. He was flying with the 418th with Ev Blakely in the lead and led that mission. And I also observed that from a leadership standpoint, he was highly regarded by the commanding officer, who was then Chick Harding, but also very much respected by General LeMay when he came down from 13th Division. So in retrospect, I think that probably he was deserving and should have been promoted to a group command or even higher during his combat experience, but he never was. And he was calm, cool, and collected. And I know how he functioned from Harry Crosby's account of flying with him, particularly on that Bremen mission, where they lost 2 engines and crash landed back in England, barely making it back. But their crew went through a very traumatic experience of being shot out of the formation on the bomb run. And how he handled himself under those conditions and handled the crew, and how highly they regarded him and respected him, certainly embellished my opinion of him. But I think my greatest respect for him came after my original crew had finished up and I flew the Bremen mission, which was my first mission after they left. Ollie Turner came to me one night while I was in the officers club and tapped me on the shoulder and told me to go get some sleep because I was flying the next day. I should add that when I got back from the Bremen mission on October the 8th of 43, because the lead ship in my squadron, which was the low squadron, consisting of Tom Murphy and Al Barker. Barker was the operations officer for the 351st, and I was leading the second element of the low squadron with a brand new crew I'd never flown with before, of course. But when I landed, because I had seen Tom Murphy's plane explode and reported that I didn't think there were any survivors, when Turner met me on landing, I was still a second lieutenant, and he immediately appointed me to replace Barker as the operations officer for the 351st Squadron. Well, I told him that was he was putting me in an awkward position because as the second lieutenant, I would be ordering captains and majors and crew members around as to where they would fly in the formation and whether they would fly or not. And he said, well, don't worry about it. We'll promote you as rapidly as possible. And I'd already been put in for my first lieutenancy, and it did come through at the end of that month. But the following month, November, the end of November, I had one more mission to fly. I'd had 24 missions under my belt. And I was in the officers club one evening, and Turner walked up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Lucky, you better go get some sleep because you're flying tomorrow." And I said, well, how so? And he said, well, we're leading the group, and I want you to fly as command pilot. And he named the crew, and I don't recall exactly who that was. But at any rate, I said, well, Ali, if we're leading the group, you ought to be flying. It's your responsibility. And he said, I know, but I want you to take this mission. So I didn't think any more about it, went to bed, and then got up the next morning and went to briefing and discovered that this was to be briefed when, well, I knew something was up because here came General LeMay, and he had never been to our group at a briefing before. And he got up on the stage and said, gentlemen, I have to tell you that I've pointed my entire military career to flying a mission like this, but General Arnold has forbidden me from leading or getting in an airplane today, or he'll court-martial me. But he says, in all honesty, I have to tell you that if we only get one plane over the target, we'll consider this mission a success. Well, they pulled back the curtain, and it was a straight line to Berlin. And that would have been the initial daylight bombing raid of Berlin by the 8th Air Force. And he said, the 100th is the only group going. And instead of bombing at the usual altitude of 25 to 29,000 feet, because the meteorologist says we've got a solid cloud cover over all of Europe, up to 10,000 feet, we want you to go in at 12,000. And when you turn on the initial point, start on your bomb run, you dive through the clouds and break out at 6,000 feet over Berlin at high noon in broad daylight and bomb the Reichstag. Well, I looked across the room at Turner and gave him the finger. And after the briefing, I looked him up and I said, you yellow son of a gun, you knew what this mission was, and you put me in this position when you're supposed to fly it. But I said, I'm going to come back from it, and when I do, if I see your ugly face, I'll kill you. Well, of course, that was rank insubordination. But if he court-martialed me, he had to fly the mission. So he didn't open his mouth. But we took off and climbed up and formed up and got to the enemy coast, and they scrubbed the mission. So we came back and landed, and I no sooner got out of the airplane than I went straight to Jack Kidd and explained to him what had happened. And I said, I cannot serve under Ollie Turner one more minute. Please give me a transfer. And he said, well, I can't blame you, Lucky, but so happens I need an operations officer over in Bucky Elton's squadron in the 350th. Would you take that job? And I said, I'm on my way. So I moved out of the 351st and, of course, thank Jack Kidd for his consideration and reassignment, and had even more respect for him than I already had. That was a good example of how and why I held him in such high regard. He was an exemplary officer. Of course, as you probably are aware, he stayed in the Air Force and was later either a major general or a lieutenant general. I've forgotten which. But he also became a rabid anti-war zealot. And he used to make lectures constantly about how futile war was and how useless it was. There weren't any victors, there were only victims.
I can definitely understand from the vignettes you shared why you had a lot of respect for Jack Kidd. I know it was a success in itself to get back from, you know, just a single mission, but you're one of the lucky few that survived 25 missions, and you did it early in the war as well. I don't know how much you recall about your last mission in February 44, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sheer feeling of relief and what it was like on that last mission you flew.
I had served for about 3 months as Bucky Elton's operations officer in the 350th, with one mission still to fly. And Bucky got sent to the rest home, the Flak House, and he was off the base. And this mission came up in mid-February of 44 that I certainly wanted to complete my missions and live through it. And so did Bill DeSanders. Bill was a lead pilot in the 350th, and I knew him pretty well. And I said, Bill, you've got one to fly, and so do I, and this is it. It was what we called a no-ball target. We thought it would be a milk run because we were tasked to bomb V-2 rocket bases right on the shore on the coast of France. And we thought we would just duck in and drop our bombs and scoot home, and that would be it. As it turned out, the Germans were alerted to us, and they came halfway across the channel to meet us, and shot us up pretty well. But we did manage to strike our targets and get back. And of course, it was such a tremendous relief to finally realize that we had survived a 25 mission tour, because so darn few of the members, particularly of the original group, and DeSanders was also of the original group as well. The relief and the realization that we'd been lucky enough to complete our tour was just indescribable. It was like lifting a heavy load off your shoulders, because psyching yourself up to get back in that airplane particularly after a rough do, was a difficult thing to do. And I get asked frequently how we did it, and I have to confess I don't actually know. We had to stay focused on our job, and that was what we were sent there to do, and we intended to complete it as best we could, and we did. But it was just a matter of dumb luck as to whether or not you managed to do it. In those days, it particularly was. Initially, we had no fighter escort to protect us, and we were going out in broad daylight. And of course, we're completely ignorant of the fact that the British were adamant against daylight bombing. They'd tried it and had been cut to ribbons by the Luftwaffe, and begged General Aker, the commandant of the 8th Air Force, to abandon daylight bombing altogether and join them in just nighttime bombing. And Aker wouldn't do it. And so Bomber Harris, the head of the RAF bomber force, prevailed upon Churchill to try to convince President Roosevelt to order us to stop daylight bombing. And President Roosevelt said no, he had faith in his Air Force commanders knowing what they were doing, and he refused. So we kept going out every day, and we could, and the British kept bombing at night. So it was sort of round the clock harassment of the Third Reich, and I think that was effective. I have some misgivings about the fact that Aker even refused to give nighttime bombing a fair trial. I'm not saying that it was superior to daylight bombing, but certainly from high altitude, we had our difficulties because of the tremendous cold and the difficulty of functioning at high altitude, where the British were going in at 12 to 15,000 feet at night, and they weren't enduring anything like those difficult conditions. But it was a different type of flying, and it wouldn't have involved formation flying either, which we prided ourselves on and felt like we could offer some mutual protection for other people in the formation. And I think to a degree that was valid, and it did work out that way. But the Luftwaffe was so experienced, and they were so practiced, and had such good equipment and excellent training, that they inflicted horrific damage on us because they developed new and better techniques of how to approach us, and at least damage us enough either with anti-aircraft or with fighter fire to force us out of the formation. And then if you're out by yourself, while you're a sitting duck, and that's when they picked us off at leisure.
I'm amazed by all the stories I hear about, how difficult it was at times to make it back from missions. But there's just an incredible amount of courage and bravery that you hear when it comes to some of these guys who, against all odds, managed to make it back or bring a crippled B-17 back. It's incredible stories of bravery, but it's an incredible airplane as well. And I know you've spoken about your love of the B-17, and you had a unique experience back in 2013. I know you were able to take the helm of a B-17 once again, 70 plus years after the war. And I was wondering, what was it like to get back in the cockpit in the air of a B-17 for you?
Well, Matt, I tried for 3 years to get somebody to let me prove that a 92-year-old guy could still handle a B-17. And when I got down to the final analysis, there was always some reason that they would give that was wouldn't allow them to do that. But when we went to Savannah for our reunion in 2013, Mike Faley called me and said that they were going to make this documentary about called Masters of the Air about the 100th Bomb Group, and the author of the book, Donald Miller, wanted to interview me if I would come to Savannah. And I was not at that time attending very many reunions. I was sort of disappointed in those that I did attend because there were so few people that I knew. Nearly all of the people that I encountered at the reunions, of course, were people that came in and flew after I did, and literally flew a different war, different time period, and had different opposition and different experiences than I did. But there were so few of the original group, particularly, that were still alive, that it was rather disappointing. So I wasn't attending many reunions, but Mike prevailed upon me to come and be interviewed. And he said, if you do, we're bringing in the Memphis Belle, and we'll give you a ride. And I said, Mike, I don't want to ride on the Memphis Belle. I want to fly it. And there was this dead silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, okay, we'll let you do that. And I said, now look, I don't want to get there and get disappointed. And I've been disappointed before, and I don't want that to happen. He said, well, don't worry about it. You got my word. We'll let you fly it. And so I showed up with my wife at Savannah, and they booked me for my interview with Donald Miller on a Friday. They set up the flight for 11:15 on a Saturday morning at the airport. And I was to be interviewed Friday afternoon late, and they postponed it to Friday night. And I said, look, I don't give a damn. I'm going to fly that airplane. I'm going to be at the airport at 11:15. I don't care whether I do the interview or not. They kept delaying it, and sure enough, because Miller was running behind and his interviews were running overtime, and eventually they scheduled me for Saturday afternoon to be interviewed. But I said, that's good enough. I'm going to be at the airport at 11:15. So I darn sure was there, and there were 6 of us that they took up on that flight. And we took off, and as soon as we got in the air, the pilot gets out of his seat and he says, Lucky, it's yours. I said, you mean it? He said, absolutely. So I sat down, and everything came back just like riding a bicycle. The old sensations, the feel, the responses of the airplane. And I loved flying the B-17. I thought it was the most graceful thing for a 4-engine bomber to be as beautifully designed as it was. And of course, had a healthy respect for its structural integrity to withstand the sort of battle damage that I sustained on many of my missions and still got home. So one of the first things I did when I did get back was to go buy some Boeing stock, because I appreciated the integrity of their product, so that I thought I'd put in with them. But it was such a thrill to really get the sensations and feel the responses of the airplane. And I guess the most pleasant thing was that I wasn't being shot at while I was doing it. But I flew it for about 30 minutes all around Savannah, and was extremely grateful for that privilege, because it was a privilege. They wouldn't let me land it or take it off because that was verboten, but at least just getting my hands on the controls and feeling it again was as I describe it, a pants wetter. It was a real thrill.